This conference will now be recorded.
And upload the video on our YouTube channel.
No problem.
Okay, well, I think we can start. There are a couple of ESRs that are still missing, but well, I hope they will join us during the speech. So good afternoon to everybody. This afternoon we have with us Silvio FUNTOWICZ. Well, for me it's an honor because you know, most of you know that I have an engineering background. No, so I majored in electronic engineering, and I also worked for a few years as an engineer. And I remember that I lived 2 years in Bolivia, and I remember that I was trying to convince indigenous people to use photovoltaic panels in very remote areas of central Bolivia. And that was a turning point for my career, because I remember that the project was basically a total failure, and I couldn't understand why those people couldn't accept, you know, the rationality of modern science. No, they were questioning the fact that they would need energy and electricity, and the photovoltaic system that are, you know, renewable and green energy. They would question the very basic, you know, principle of what I was like offering them. No, so that one was a turning point. So when I go back to Europe and start looking at you know, reason why certain people don't accept modern science, I came across the work of Silvio and others. No, but I remember that my first reading was probably the book, the seminal book by Thomas Kuhn, no, the how scientific revolution worked, no, and I remember that was the first time that I encountered this notion of normal science, no. The idea that in each moment in history, there is something that is commonly accepted in science that is called normal science, and then at the margin is where science really move forward. No, there are like crazy people that are trying to experiment or to understand why certain things don't fit in the model, into the common model of the normal science, and this is where science move forward. No. So just this introduction is functional to introducing Silvio, because Silvio, between the 70s and the 80s, come up with this idea of post-normal science. No, that is a way to advance into this idea that science is something human. No, it's something social. It's a social process. It's not something that is totally in the vacuum. It's not something that is totally neutral. No. And during our work together, we already came across a similar concept. For example, the notion of responsible innovation, and why me and other people here present this idea that innovation and technology are never neutral. No, they always embed the values, the worldview of the people who design and who implement it. So today we have Silvio, who will talk about a little bit more this notion of post-normal science and why science is inherently political, and with a specific emphasis to the big things of the moment, no, the pandemic of COVID-19. Silvio is a professor at the University of Bergen, and he's a very long career, so I don't have the time to make a summary of all his previous appointments. I would just say that he was involved for many years in the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and of course he is author of many papers published in international journal. Probably the most cited one is the Science for Post-Normal Age, that was published by the journal Future. So Silvio, the floor is yours. You have like between 30 and 40 minutes, and then I will collect questions in the chat, and possibly we will have a nice discussion about how normal science can inform a circular economy, which is the main topic of our network.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you all for being with me here, at least virtually, no? And I hope that I can tell you a few things that are not only interesting but useful for your work. As I'm in general, I don't use the PowerPoint presentations, so you're stuck with me, and I'm asking you to just to listen to my story. I will show you a couple of slides, but they're mainly for you to just to fix in the memory. As Mario said, I have been around for a long time. Originally, my degrees are in mathematics, but I changed during the years, as many of you changed, and I became a philosopher of science. And then I went to work for the European Commission at the Joint Research Center. I worked there for almost 25 years until I retired. At the time, you had to retire at 65. And then I started a new career as a university professor at the University of Bergen, working at the interface between science and politics, science or what we call governance. I hope everybody can hear me well, right? Good. Now, in the short blurb I wrote, and you could see to introduce or to advertise my presentation, I would call it science that is appropriate for the COVID or the post-COVID age. And then I said that, many of you perhaps witness in your different places that people are tired of the situation, and many are quite nostalgic of the pre-COVID era. And usually in all the presentations and lectures, people say, when can we go back to normality? And my argument is that even if we could go back to the pre-COVID normality, which I really put always in between, inverted commas, we should remember what was exactly that normality. And in particular, you are talking about the circular economy, main theme of your work. But why do we talk about the circular economy? Because we realized and we are aware that there are problems of sustainability. And the challenge is the missing goals that we put ourselves. I started to work on sustainability in 1992 when I participated in the Rio conference. Do you remember, some of you, the conference of Rio de Janeiro, 1992? That was the first United Nations conference on the environment. And that conference, worldwide conference, was done because people realized that there were serious problems with our environment. There were environmental problems, environmental risks. And at that time, in the Rio conference, there was a special chapter called Agenda 21, which was called Local Sustainability, Promoting Sustainability. That's the first time that sustainability becomes a political worldwide goal. Okay, so I've been around, and then I organized meetings for the European Commission in the United Nations and other places, and I have always a sense of deja vu. We always say we have to do, and we can repeat the arguments, and not really a lot has happened. So what I say is that some of the problems we had before COVID, the normality before COVID, was where we had problems with the sustainability. We had big climate and ecosystems disruptions. We have loss of biodiversity. We have growing socioeconomic inequalities. We have weak and weaker political institutions. We have authoritarian temptations. And we have a host of magical technoscientific promises. Okay? These problems didn't disappear. I would say that actually they are now worse. No, they are now worse. So my argument, my controversial argument, that even if we could go back, we shouldn't. Okay. Now, and I'm saying even if we could, because it's not certain that we can go back in the sense as we were before. Okay. Now, the next point I want to share with you is the following. You know, in history, and here I have to say that I don't know you and I don't know your backgrounds, but perhaps this type of subject is rather alien to your training and to your work. So I'll ask you to give you some, as Mario said in the presentation, a kind of historical context of development. And one thing we know from history is that catastrophes, disasters, were also opportunities. And these are opportunities because there is always the idea of change, and change is always a tragedy. But when disasters, tragedies, catastrophes occur, then what we have is we have to balance the tragedy of change with the tragedy of the catastrophe. And then it opens new opportunities. Now, in European history, that happened around the 1650 with the treaties of Westphalia. You know, Europe was in a very bad state. Famine, the plague, all type of problems, continuous wars. And after around 1650, the Treaty of Westphalia, or the treaties of Westphalia, created the new modern state. So that was great innovation, social institutionalized scientific innovation. And we carry on today with the institutions and the developments that emerged around that year with the treaties of Westphalia. Then around the 1755, if someone is coming from Portugal, you know, there was the big Lisbon earthquake. And the earthquake generated big discussions among philosophers, politicians, scientists, And it was very influential in the development of the Enlightenment. Now, perhaps COVID, with its worldwide pandemic, is giving us an opportunity where we can learn from the past history and see how we can overcome and face together these challenges. Okay, now I'll give you just for you information two very important innovations that came with the Westphalia and the Lisbon earthquake and the modern state. The first is the creation of statistics. Statistics was created for provide numbers, indicators through the statistical offices to, in a sense, check the idea about what's the state of the state. No, statistics is the science of the state, and it has to do with the state as an institution. It's got to do with like state of affairs, So statistics was one of big innovations. The other one is the idea of progress. And progress didn't exist until the scientific revolution. And it became institutionalized around after, by the end of 1700, with people like Condorcet, who was always, for those who have done economics or statistics, have know the name. And Condorcet is the inventor of of progress. And what was interesting is that they believe really, and that goes a tradition, goes back to Bacon, to Newton, to others, the idea that scientific and technological progress goes hand in hand with moral and political progress. Okay? These two things go together. And that's an innovation, an invention that has to do with the modern state and the Enlightenment. Okay? Now, you and Mario mentioned about responsible innovation, I think, if I remember correctly, right? And the idea, well, if you asked Condorcet or someone of people around that age, they will say, why do we should put responsible in front of innovation? Innovation is always responsible. The fact that now today we have to say, oh, there is responsible innovation is because we believe that there is also irresponsible innovation. And that's new. Until quite recently, research and innovation was always good and positive and responsible. The fact that now we are questioning and we have to put this another R in front of our I is because, well, there are doubts about that. Okay, now, I'm now going into more the subject of my presentation, already, is that since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we started a bit more than a year ago. I had to attend a meeting in Barcelona at the beginning of February and then go to Bergen to teach my course in February, and I couldn't go. No? Almost immediately the lockdown started here in Milan where I live. Okay? So many people recalled that around 40 years ago, we developed an idea of post-normal science. And that the COVID pandemic conditions resemble the characteristics, the features that define post-normal science. That was done by Jerry Ravetz and me. At that time, we were at the University of Leeds in the early 80s. And we developed our work on uncertainty mainly, but also put the basis of on post-normal science. Now, what are the, if I can now, I will share it later. The conditions that define a problem as post-normal are as follows, and remember them. They are four. Four. The first one is that facts are uncertain. I will put it later, but remember, facts are uncertain. The second is that there are values that usually they are in dispute. So you have a clash of value systems in relation to the problem. The third one is that the stakes, what is at stake in the problem, can be huge. And the fourth is that decisions are urgent. And you can immediately associate these four conditions to the status of the COVID problem. Facts are still very uncertain. We know what we know what we don't know, and we don't know what we don't know. And if you follow the discussions by immunologists, virologists, epidemiologists, you will see that they declare their degree of uncertainty and degree of ignorance. Now, the second about the values in dispute, well, you see immediately that do we save lives or we save the economy? And you could go different countries, use different criteria. And I said only these two, but there are many other elements that where values were in dispute, which I won't go into detail because you can also imagine them yourselves. The third is that the stakes are high. I mean, so many people dead, livelihoods, people enclosed, and I'm not talking about the rich people, I'm talking about the normal people, poor people, enclosed in small apartments, families with histories perhaps of domestic violence and things of that type. All the psychological problem generated, you can imagine. All those stakes are very high or potentially very high. They'll be realized. And the last one is about the decisions urgent. There was an editorial in The Lancet almost at the beginning, is that the editorial in The Lancet said, it's like we have to fly an airplane we haven't started to build yet. And so you see, every day we learn more things, and every day we know that there are things that are still we don't know. Okay, so we have to make decisions, and this is why so many times decisions were changed. Historically, people are gamblers with risks, because sometimes risks never materialize, so we can gamble. And this is what happened. Some countries kept things open, some people closed, they open and they close according to different type of pressures and information. So what you have is a situation which we called the post-normal science. Okay? Now, what is important, and now I'll share my my screen and you tell me if it works, okay? Yes. Can you see it? Okay. Now, if you don't mind, I will not put it all, but if you can see that diagram, is important. What shows the diagram?
Silvio, we no longer see it.
Oh, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, it seems that when I put it, I changed the screen. So you tell me if there are problems. Okay. So the diagram, what it shows is what I will call the traditional problem-solving strategy of the modern state. The modern state that emerged, as I told you before, after the Westphalia treaties. So if a society had a practical political problem, the solving strategy was to translate it into a technical problem. You solve the technical problem and then you consider that the practical problem was solved. Is that clear? So, and that was because all problems were considered simple. In the case where we have a complex problem, this translation, this reduction of a practical political problem into a technical problem doesn't work more because a complex problem is essentially ambiguous. And what I mean by ambiguous is that there is not a one-to-one translation. So, as you can see in the COVID problem, from one practical political problems, you might derive many different technical problems, which sometimes are in contradiction. I don't have the time to show you examples, but think about it in relation to your COVID experience. And those different technical translations cannot be reduced to a unique tradition. And that is precisely the definition of complexity, which is that a complex problem is when there is a plurality of legitimate perspectives that cannot be reduced to a single one. Okay? So you necessarily has to work with these multiple translations. So there is not one single technical problem except magic that will solve the COVID practical political issue. Okay? My professor used to say that for every complex problem, there is a simple solution, and it is wrong. Now, once I show you that, I will say what was our solution or our approach to the problem with a political problem which needed a scientific and technical input that had the features which I mentioned before. And here I will pick to the second one, let's call it the mantra, okay? The mantra. Facts uncertain, values in dispute, stakes high, and decisions urgent. What we argue then is that if you have this type of problems, the traditional normal science or even engineering type of approach doesn't work. And we should think that the purpose of doing science that is relevant to governance is no longer to find the truth. Okay? But what becomes important is this an idea of quality. In other words, how good is your process and product in relation to a purpose? And for those who are working in engineering and have done some work in quality assurance, they understand the definition of quality is precisely a fitness for purpose. The idea that what you do, your product, your processes have to fit a certain purpose. And what we say is that in this case, a purpose is determined socially and politically. And this is why in this diagram, what we argue is that as soon as a problem becomes post-normal with those characteristics, you have to extend those, and we call it extended peer community, we have to extend the community of those who produce and evaluate the relevant knowledge. Is that clear? Later, if you have questions, I will go back to in detail. But substantially, think about it. If you are a physicist, a biologist, or biochemist, whatever, when you work on that, your peer community is those who studied with you, no? Who studied the same faculty, same department, who published in the same journals, okay? And those people are the peer community, and those are those who are judging the quality of your output. If your paper will be published, if you get a job, if your project will be approved. As soon as you go to the second area, which we called, that we call professional consultancy, you see immediately, if you are engineer, if you are a medical doctor, if you are an architect, immediately your peer community is extended. There are other people who are judging your quality. It's not only other engineers, other doctors. There is a full structure. Historically, you have the example of the Sumerian code of Hammurabi. And if an engineer built a house and the house fell, the engineer paid with his life. Or Chinese medicine, where you pay the doctor when you were not ill, where you were healthy. That's a kind of insurance. So, and what we say is that those professions have a totally different social construct with a social contract with society than that of a scientist. Sometimes in some places, if you are an engineer or an architect or doctor, you have to go through colleges and other type of qualifications. It's not enough to finish the university because the stakes and the risks that are involved in your profession. And so on. So what you have is this idea of quality as soon as stakes go up or uncertainty goes up, the community of people judging the processes and the products is extended and become quite similar to the political process. And fundamentally, values cannot be hidden, but are part of the whole equation. Now, if this is, let me see, if this is clear, and we can go back, I have to say that these two things, the diagram I showed and the mantra, are a couple, and quality are a few insights of post-normal science. Post-normal science is not new, it's not a new scientific method, okay, is not a new attempt to become normal. It doesn't prescribe solutions, but it is a problem-solving strategy that we feel is perfectly useful when you are in a situation, as I mentioned before. Okay, and this is why, and here again we can think about COVID. In COVID, if you look at in your own countries, in your own places, to the to who was consulted for who was consulted. They say most of the governments say we follow the science, right? You heard that. We follow the science. But who were the scientists that were consulted? A very limited number of disciplines. Okay? Whereas we know that there are more knowledge around, that science doesn't speak with one voice, and that knowledge doesn't speak only with the science voice. We know that in terms that there are problems, social problems, anthropological problems, psychological problems, there are practical problems that were not even consulted. We know that most of the people in the first line, nurses and doctors in intensive care and other type of people, had learned a lot. They were not consulted. Why? Because the privilege we put on science. Okay? So, post-normal science, what it says, is fundamentally trans-scientific. It goes beyond the disciplinary boundaries, and it attempts to be like a choreography of knowledges. Now, in relation to that, I have to say, and I'm almost done, I have 7 minutes left, but we see that more and more people are realizing that we are in a situation where our standard, our normal way of doing things does not work. And therefore, we have to experiment. Think about it. And it's good that I mentioned COVID because everybody has experienced, you have experienced it in your own life, in your body, in families, in your community, and things like that. So everybody knows about these things. So we have to experiment. Once we say that normal science doesn't work, cannot predict, it means that we don't have a blueprint for the future. Okay? We don't have a blueprint for the future. Therefore, we have to experiment. And experiments, as you know, those who do science and other, is that experiments sometimes go wrong. And we make mistakes. Okay? So the problem becomes a political one, an institutional one. How do we come to terms with the fact that we cannot predict and we cannot control? That we are going to work on solutions that might be wrong, might fail, right? And that becomes a fundamental cultural and institutional and legal shift, even a constitutional one, right? After so many hundreds of years believing that we can predict we can manage, we can control, to come to a point where we can say, I'm sorry, we can't. And that becomes a fundamental challenge. More important than the other stuff is to realize that we'll have to improvise, we'll have to learn, and we are bound to make mistakes. And thus, what we argue is that the problem, or what we say, the challenge becomes precisely a question of belief. There was an Italian politician and philosopher called Antonio Gramsci, and he almost 100 years ago, he wrote about the situation, political situation in Spain and in Italy, and he said, history teaches, but it has no students. So that if we look at history, we might learn, but there are no people learning from history. Well, what I want to say in my last minutes is that we have to show that Gramsci was wrong and that we can learn. And this is why I try to put the whole thing in context, as I have said, how historically we have learned. And how it's important to look and learn from history and change accordingly. So that was what I wanted to tell you today, and I'll be happy to answer your questions if I can, and I hope it was interesting for you.
Okay, thank you very much, Silvio. It was very provoking and stimulating a short speech, I would say. Okay, so I ask everybody to put their question in the chat, and probably have like a first question that can probably set the scene, no? So you discuss about the COVID as an example, like a classical example of a situation that can be faced using the lens of post-normal science, no? And the main focus of our Marie Curie network is the circular economy, no? Circular economy is also like a classical buzzword that actually is like can be seen as an empty container that can be filled with whatever you want. Actually, no, you can put sustainability, you can be economic growth, you can put anything you want there. But essentially, there is a strong connection with this notion of sustainability, and we know for sure, even though if of course it's uncertain, we don't have all the knowledge about it, but we know that pandemic, especially this kind of pandemic, is directly connected with the ecosystem destruction, right? So the call for sustainability is also a call for reduce the risk that we are creating through technology and through this idea of economic growth, right? Because in the name of economic growth, we develop our technology, you know, and we develop our technology to boost economic growth. And eventually, it appears that with this explosion of economic activity, we destroy the ecosystem and we open the door to unpleasant disaster like plastic in the ocean, but also viruses in bats and other wild animals. No, so I think that there is a strong connection between this idea of creating circular economy that are regeneratives, that are able to sustain life, human and non-human life, and this idea of control. No, so my point is that I think it is very important to develop a sustainability science that abandon this myth of control, but how we can do it practically. No, so I always use this expression that my supervisor, my PhD, John Besson, said. He's an engineer. What we do on Monday morning. So on Monday morning, we woke up, and what we do with these tools of post-normal science. Now, how we operationalize, it's a terrible word, how we put in practice this idea of post-normal science in our city council, for example, or in our university department. I know that you are, because I know your work, so I know that you have like some very practical tools, but probably most of the PhD students here don't have like a concrete idea of the kind of tools of analysis that you proposed in the past. No, let me just, a very quick overview of the possibility that are there to like implement post-normal science.
Yes. Now, of course, that's a critical question. How do you do it, and how do you do it now? Okay, or how do you start doing it? As I say, I talked for 35 minutes, and the subject of circular economy is quite interesting, because in a paper we wrote with Mario Giampietro, we call it a policy legend. Okay, because and I want to be clear, I'm not against recycling, okay? Because some people think that when you talk about, you criticize the notion of a circular economy, then you're against recycling. Well, that's nonsense. What we were trying to say is that there are good scientific and thermodynamic reasons why the economy is not circular. Okay, and that has serious consequences. And we have created something that we call the uncomfortable knowledge hub, where we try to address these policy legends, some idea like the European Green Deal or other type of ideas that, as you put it, is an empty vessel. An empty vessel, like, and I want to be controversial, okay? Like the Sustainable Development Goals. You are not going to solve the problem with indicators. Mainly the indicators, as I say, and that's the reason why statistics and indicators were created, is to show that the problem is not so big and we are improving, okay? Because this is how it is. The problem is more substantial. And you mentioned some of this. And the idea that a pandemic is like we are living is not one-off, and has to do precisely with destruction of ecosystems and biodiversity and other types of things. My colleague, friend David Walter Toes, we are having a lecture next week precisely. He's a veterinary, an epidemiologist, and we talked about the next pandemic. And if you listened in relation to the climate change and to the disappearance of permafrost, that bacteria that were there for millions of years are starting to reappear. Clearly, those things were not domesticated like cats and dogs and pigs and things like that with us for thousands of years. So we really don't know. So the common sense and the precautionary thing to do is to put things together and think what is the relation, which I think is something that the IPBES is trying to do, the IPCC for biodiversity, which in a sense is a good example of a post-normal approach, where you have this dialogue among cultures and among knowledges and the ideas that I was trying to develop. But your question was more precise. And it is, what do we do? Okay, what do we do? And as I said, each of us is in a different situation. Most of the PhD students and postdocs have very limited degrees of freedom. We discussed that in our university with people doing PhDs and so on. They are already straitjacket into a certain trajectory, which is clearly not post-normal. Everybody knows that the type of evaluations you have for your work, for your production, for your career are perverse. But everybody does it because it's not alternative. I will not ask people to destroy their livelihood. So the advice I can to get is just to say, to try to understand if your problem is of a post-normal side, to understand that you are not dealing only with facts, that your values are fundamental. And that is not anti-scientific, okay? But it goes to the heart of the scientific method. This is important. Think about your use, as I say, of statistics, of your research methodology is full with choices that are non-scientific, and they reflect on your values, or what you believe, what you don't believe, assumptions, and all the rest. So one should start with that. The second is that you have to know that there are other types of knowledge that can be important and relevant for your problem-solving situation. Okay? Many problems that humanity have faced have not been solved by science, but by practical knowledge. Think, for example, the problem of longitude, a fundamental problem in navigation. If not, you couldn't, Europe could not develop into a colonial power. That was solved by a clockmaker in Yorkshire, not by the Royal Society. And this is why they didn't want to give him the prize that the Parliament. So once you realize those things, that's what's considered second-class knowledge, and it is not. Practical knowledge is fundamental, and that extends to other types of knowledge. So when you're in a situation, what you want to do, and you go and look at the literature, you go at the precedents, you go at and alternatives, you could say, okay, why should I limit myself to what is my discipline's tradition, or even the scientific tradition? Let's look what other people are doing that are not scientists, if they found ways, and try to we use the word, that perhaps you have heard about the co-production of knowledge. That knowledge is done in, as Mario said at the beginning, it's done by people, by societies, by culture and history. So this is important, and that will be also second suggestion. The third, and perhaps then we can go to other questions from you, is to realize that it is no good to hide yourself in your bubble, to hide yourself in your own fortress in terms of knowledge. It's an extension of what I said before, but it is important because if we are all in this problem, sustainability problem is a humanities problem, okay? As all the other things we're talking about. Is a problem that humanity is facing. It's not a small part or some part, you know. And therefore, you'll have to live with people that you don't like, that you don't like how they are, what they think, how they behave, what their politics are. But what's the alternative? So, process, extensive process is fundamental because the alternative is violence, you know, and this is something we tried and we continue to try. And in my view, with my experience, it doesn't work. Okay, so these are small, and the idea that goes together with everything I said is, as I said, the future is not written. Okay, the future is to be constructed. So we should believe that if we can construct a quality process, we'll be able to find quality responses, quality products that will be necessarily provisional, but it's a building process. No, so and it not only has to do with science or what we want to do, and we have to change institutions because institutions were not done for that. Were not created, okay, for that. Were created for the old regime, an old order, as I say, in Europe, and now globally, the order that was created after Westphalia. We are now, and this is important for you to remember, the problems we have are not the result of a failure, but the result of a big success. On one hand, science and technology were very successful. And also, the government's institutions were very successful. We know how to write and read. We are all in the information and communication technology, in social networks. Each of us believe that we have an identity, and that's the result precisely of the development from the Enlightenment, human rights, and free will, and all the other things. So don't dismiss those things as failures. They are success. And those success take us to the crisis. Another opportunity, if you're interested, talking from mathematics, I can show you that every time you have a success, you have a crisis in mathematics. Okay, so, and that has to in physics and biology and everything. So let's think again. I don't know. Is my point of view.
Yeah, thank you, Silvio. I don't know. There are questions that Akis, Andrea. No, what you say about the successful that great disaster is also something that is very well known in STS study, and the way we sum up this problem saying that any innovation is solving problem by creating new problems.
Mm-hmm.
No, anytime we create a new technology, with the success of solving specific problem, we create new problems. Think about nuclear energy, for example, or even like many kind of renewable energy. Here in the region I live, there is a huge debate about wind turbines, for example. No, it's true that we are generating green energy, but at the same time we are dispossessing people from their lands. There are problems of who manage this energy, who is benefiting from this energy. There are environmental impact problems as well. So, and I think this is very relevant when we are studying circular economy. That is also very linked to the notion of developing new technology or new processes, new artifacts as well. Akis has a question. Akis.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mauro. Thank you, Professor, for this amazing lecture. So, you said a few minutes ago that the problems we have are not due to a failure, but a huge success. There is also this idea that in order to evaluate something as a success depends on the duration it has in order to be considered a success. So could we say that a failure is actually the lack of duration of something is related to the duration that something has? Because we need to create something in order to categorize it and classify this as a success and as a failure. And just to be more specific, I mean, the dominant economic system that we have now is based on the notion of growth. And yes, I mean, one of the most popular arguments that advocates of this idea have is that capitalism has brought many good things, and we have like welfare and prosperity. At least that's what they say. However, nowadays, I think we are witnessing one of the most prevalent crises of this system. So, shall we talk about a success, or shall we talk about a failure, like our failure to understand how short is this a success? I hope I could describe it in a better way.
No, it's a very deep question, really, an argument you made. You know, what you consider a success or a failure, as you put it, is a contextual. Okay, it's not something that you can isolate from the context. And time is important. Time is important. Now, if I if I have to elaborate on this, I have to say that what one of the main features of our modern state, because we are still living in that frame of mind, institution, culture, and history, and it goes back to, you're in Athens, so goes back to Greek scientific and cultural tradition, is that we can define unambiguously what is true and false, what is good and bad, what is success and failure. Okay? And in economic terms, it's like the mainstream paradigm will argue that what is one of the associated with the idea of growth and economic success? Efficiency, for example. Okay? Efficiency. But then we put it in the complex systems that where we should, because if we talked about the circular economy, we talked about the economy and the ecosystems and all that. We are talking about a complex system. Then you realize that when you're in a simple system, efficiency means one thing. When you're in a complex system, it means something different, which is that more efficient you are, the less adaptation and resilient you are. So some solutions that work for simple system on efficiency, well, will destroy resilience. For example, you need redundancy. And in terms of redundancy is not economic. And some of the big failures of economic system as we have is precisely because we destroy all the elements of redundancy, other type of things that make the complex system change and adapt, right? So substantially, when we talk about success and failure, we have to look at it, and that's the point I was trying to say, from different perspectives. At one level, you can try to be efficient, but you have to look at a meta level, and then you will see that you're making the system less robust. And that's the idea that I think Mario and you have hinted. I don't know if I got it wrong, but this idea that when I mentioned the problem-solving strategy, which is reduction from a political problem to a techno-scientific one, the other problem solving that we have used along history was make the system more complex. Complexification was also in a problem-solving strategy. And once you make the system more complex, you are losing adaptation. You are less resilient. And we know, and there's a lot of literature on the Joseph Tainter and wrote the book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, another work we did, and it is precisely on that. And the whole, you can think the circular economy as making the system even more complex. And those type of things. For those, as I say, the last thing I want to say, because this is, I don't know it's exactly what you were hinting, but my idea is that if you look at it since 1945, which was the end of the Second World War, the level of replacement is shorter. And so what you consider a success is shortening the time, and then you consider a failure and you displace it with a different type of technology or a different type of approach, and things are getting shorter and shorter. Okay, so we know about the displacement of Jeroen van der Sluis, my colleague, call it the displacing of misery, to explain how in order to solve certain problems in agriculture, well, you use DDT and pesticides, you create other type of problems, and then you have the problems in Africa about agriculture, you create the green economy, and then you have other problems. Constantly, you have problems with the ozone layer, so you replace the CFCs, and then you have other type of problems. So you are displacing misery, substantial. But the point which for me is important is that these displacements are becoming faster. And if you look at it from a complex system dynamics, you immediately realize that when you have that, you go into some kinds of instability and discontinuity. It's like first you had 100 years to 100 years, and you can think even in political terms or institutional terms. Before a country had a constitution, it lasted for a long time, and you change laws and all type of things to solve everyday problems. Now everybody wants to change constitutions. And that shows that the system is quite unstable. Okay? And the way to go forward, again, and answering, is to reinforce all the mechanisms that make it more robust and resilient in view of adaptation, and so in particular in view of to have a precautionary approach once we are aware that we don't know. We know a lot, but we know a lot that we don't know. Okay, so that's this is what I'm trying to say, and that implies big changes also in our social organizations. If you think about continental European constitutions, continent are essentially related to science, to the type of science that was created during modernity. So can you think of what would look a constitution of a state when you relate it to a kind of what we call a post-normal science? Okay.
Yeah, and I think this what you just said is particularly relevant for a country like India, in which their constitution, for example, in India, there is in their constitution there is a specific reference to science, and actually they use this expression, the temple of science. So they use science as a religion. That's amazing, and this also implies the rejection and the neglection of all the traditional knowledge, which is huge and very rich in India, which is basically a continent, right? So they completely neglect all the history in the name of modern science. That is also something that was like applied within a colonial order in India. But by the way, a classical example of displacing problem is this idea of geoengineering. No, this is a classical way of displacing problem of climate change. No, which is with the stereotype of complex problem, right? This idea that we can manage solar radiation by injecting or putting material particles in the atmosphere to shield the solar radiation, and then we can easily control this. And actually, we don't know anything about, well, we don't know enough about the physics of the atmosphere. So thinking of controlling this complex system is like, I mean, it's very difficult. Mike has a question. He says CFC don't affect the ozone layer.
Well, I wouldn't say in effect that that's not the part of my argument. My argument is that the Montreal Protocol was precisely related to that, and in explicitly, although there were important political consideration and economic consideration. Margaret Thatcher accepted the Montreal Protocol because some of the chemical industry in Britain, they say they had a substitution already. So these are how you can understand the protocols and things. You know, some people are saying today that DDTs are not so bad and pesticides and things like that sometimes. So I'm not going into the controversy about those things. What I'm saying is that that's the part of the dialectic between science, politics, and international agreements. Okay?
Yeah. We have another question by Akis.
Yeah, Professor, sorry to ask you again. You mentioned like a book, I think, related to complex society. Could you please repeat the author, if possible?
Yes, I think Mario knows the book, right? Joseph Tainter. Let me try to write it here.
Yes, the book is called How Civilization Collapsed, something like
No,
that.
no, it's yes, it's the collapse of complex societies. Collapse, and the author, who is a good friend of mine, is called Joseph Tainter.
Yeah.
Tainter. Okay, and that's a classic book. But the other books, he gives example along history. This was published in a collection of archaeology, I think. He's a historian archaeologist, and shows how civilization from the old civilization up to Latin American civilizations have collapsed. The Mayas, in relation to, they went beyond the boundaries of their ecosystems and things like that. And it's an interesting perspective. On geoengineering, you must know that many papers on geoengineering refer to post-normal science, and because of the conditions. And not only that, I'm quite happy, pleased to see how many of the recent papers on conservation biology refer all to post-normal science.
Well, I worked a lot with Richard Owen in the UK. So
I know him.
no, he was my PhD supervisor as well. So we did a lot of work with the EPSRC in the UK to try to, implement at least some notion of reflectivity in the way they allocate public money to science and engineering in the UK. It was like a partial success, I would say, but there's still a lot of institutional constraint in terms of.
Of course, but I sent around, I don't know if you distributed it or Patricia, there was a couple of weeks ago, there was a program on the BBC, right? BBC Radio on post-normal science and COVID pandemic, and an article in The Guardian about that, where many interesting people that perhaps you don't know, but it is interesting. If you go to the podcast in Radio 4, you can listen to the program, and you will see that all these arguments are no longer taboo. As I was saying, to say that you can grow without having economic growth is no longer taboo. The idea that we can look at other forms of growth that are not economic. And so we are transitioning, and as I say, we have to understand that all transitions are painful. They are losers and winners, and change is a tragedy. But we should try not to make it more violent than it needs to be.
Yeah, exactly. And then actually, just because you mentioned Antonio Gramsci, I'm a big fan of me and Andrea, another in this network. We are a big fan of Antonio Gramsci. He's also say that in times of transition, when the new is struggling to emerge and the old is to die, there is where monster appears, and it was almost like a prophecy, because he was basically writing at the time in which Adolf Hitler was raising in Germany.
Yes, he was in jail.
So maybe he couldn't learn something from the past, but maybe something about the
future. But it's interesting. I always quote that and say the old is dying, the new cannot emerge, and in the meantime we see all these pathological situations. Okay, but think about it, all of you. No, Gramsci wrote this almost 100 years ago, right? And you could say that he can write it today, and it will be true also today. What do we learn from that? What we learn from that is that the old never dies completely, and the new never emerges completely. So we are always in between. and the pathologies will appear constantly. And he could have written it in 1700, in 600, and if we survive, it will be written in 2200 if they are still humans and we are not cyborgs around that time. So it's interesting to see that in terms of a dynamic process, okay? And in that sense, it's quite amazing, no? Well, I hope I will not boring you too much, and if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Yeah, well, I don't know if there are questions. I want to just to mention to the PhD students is that Silvio also developed like a more quantitative methods to analyze risk and reduce uncertainty. And if you look at, I can send you some links later. He developed this NUSAP methods,
Yeah.
which is a notational system for managing and dealing with uncertainty that is based on number 5, if I remember correctly, 5 dimensions. So just to communicate to the PhD students is if they are working on some using some quantitative kind of.
It's very much now fashionable in life cycle assessment and this type of things. They are using it, the pedigree and all that. Some of my colleagues develop it as also to evaluate models and indicators and other type of things. So with age, I leave to the young people to do the practical work, and I'm more on the thinking side now. But there's a lot of very exciting applications of all these type of things. I'm quite happy. Jeroen van der Sluis, who has a website, unfortunately, it's not updated quite regularly, is called nusap.net, nusap.net. So there's a lot of material and application of our uncertainty way, how to, qualify uncertainty and evaluate quality.
Yeah, and me, Andrea, we are about to start a new project on circular economy, in which we criticize this idea of circular economy, and there are former students of Mario Giampietro from the ICTA. Maybe I think I'm pretty sure that Maddalena Ripa. They are working on quantitative storytelling. So I think this we will really consider to use this kind of approach in our new project, which is study about how we can design initiative for circular economy that take into account different numbers of stakeholders, take into account different voices, including traditional knowledge, and most of the half of the partners are from Africa. So there are also like all this debate about how we include additional knowledge, how we link traditional knowledge to modern science, and how we can complement traditional knowledge with science.
There is a couple of weeks ago, or last week, there's a paper in Nature done by many authors of IPES, where they developed this subject precisely about how to integrate and share different knowledge systems and different languages. What I want to say is that we have to be very careful with these things like circular economy, because there is this kind of what I call the imperialist element of the economics into language. They appropriate the language. Okay, I criticize some of my colleagues and friends when they put a monetary value to the ecosystems. Okay, because philosophers said that the person who dominates language has power. Okay, and we should avoid these type of things, because then you have natural capital, then you have human capital, then you have social capital, and all those type of things. You are already in a slippery slope that because you enter into a language that is different. And language is, is not something superficial. Tell you a story to finish. Everybody knows Alice Through the Looking Glass, Lewis Carroll. Okay. And do you remember Humpty Dumpty? That was the guy who had like an egg, who was always sitting on top of, So there's a discussion between Alice and Humpty Dumpty, and Alice said, Alice was really scandalized by the way Humpty Dumpty say words. And the meaning, she said, arbitrary meanings that he gave to words. And so he said, words mean something. And Humpty Dumpty said, what words mean is according to who is the master. And at that time, if you think about it, for those who, we are all speaking English, although we come from different places, and master in English is a teacher, right? But is also the owner, okay? Like a master of slaves. So Lewis Carroll already and Humpty Dumpty knew the relation between knowledge and power. So you don't have to be a postmodern anti-science to realize that knowledge is related to power. Lewis Carroll knew it, and many others knew it a long time ago. So forget about natural capital. Don't talk the language of human capital. Just avoid it.
Yeah, that's what was a wonderful ends of for the workshop. I don't know if Andrea wants to say something. Andrea is the project coordinator, is the network coordinator, and me and Andrea, we wrote recently last year a paper on circular economy, looking through Marxist lens and using also the notion of a conviviality of Ivan Illich, no? That was
Ivan Illich, yeah, of course.
Was very much whereabouts the difference between, the connection between knowledge and how it's constructed. And so in the paper, we criticize the notion of circular economy, but we also say that probably we need to construct spaces to reappropriate, to occupy.
We have to reappropriate the language, yes, absolutely. Language battle. Perhaps you don't know, we have a paper with some colleagues that was published, I can't remember the journal, but one of these environmental journals called Technique is Never Neutral. I don't know if you saw it, but if you are interested, I can send the reference. We look at different areas with different lenses, and we show how techniques are never neutral. Okay.
And do you want to say some concluding remarks? Or?
No, I just came across the Technique is Never Neutral paper. I think it's published in Environmental Science and Policy, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I was reading it recently. Very good one. No, thank you, Professor Silvio. I think it has been a very insightful seminar, and hopefully will give food for thought to our early stage researchers. And yeah, I mean, we would be glad to invite you once again in the near future. Maybe we can talk about news up in more detail. So we could also focus a little bit on the different approaches that have been developed within the post-normal science framework. And we could also encourage our ESRs to use them to evaluate, in this case, for instance, circular economy policy, and understanding also the unintended consequences that a non-critical application of this sort of policy measures could lead to. So yeah, thank you very much. That's been a very insightful talk, and we look forward to further interactions in the near future. Hopefully, we'll be able to meet in person soon. Yeah, it will be our pleasure to invite you to one of our network events, which we will organize as soon as the situation gets better. I really liked the opening statement of the seminar from you, you know, that we shouldn't get back to normality, because in my view, you know, normality, as also Mario said, was what caused this problem, and normality was also the reason why we couldn't solve the problem earlier. Absolutely. Thank you very much for being with us today, and see you all soon.
It was a pleasure. Thank you also to Patricia, who organized all the details so well.
Okay, so thank you very much. Gracias, Silvio, and okay, I'll see you in the next network events. Bye bye.
Thank you very much. A presto.
Presto.
Thank you.
Ciao.